Hello, friends. My name is Gabriel, and this is Exploring the Quran and the Bible. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Yasir Qadhi, an extremely well-known intellectual and leader of the Muslim American community. We speak a bit about his work, both in the academy and his work in the community. And then we turn to a fascinating verse of the Quran, the verse of the covenant, which by some elements of the tradition is understood to represent a primordial covenant in which all of humanity collectively acknowledges the lordship of God, but there are other interpretations possible. One of those is presented by Dr. Qadhi in regard to the thought of Ibn Taymiyya. So you'll discover more about Dr. Qadhi's own thought, about Ibn Taymiyya, and about the verse of the covenant. Thank you so much for joining, friends. Please take a moment to like this video and to subscribe to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. Hello, Dr. Yasir Qadhi. Thank you so much for joining me on Exploring the Quran and the Bible.
Hey, Gabriel, it's my pleasure. Nice to see you.
Yeah, the pleasure is mine. I have a brief introduction, then we'll have some questions, then we'll have a presentation on the topic of a really important verse in the Quran that has a long tradition of study and speculation and debate around it, namely the covenant verse. But before we get to the introduction and the questions, I want to give you the opportunity just to present yourself and speak about this occasion appearing on this channel.
Yes, Gabriel, a lot of people know we go back quite a while. We were, we studied at Yale together. We have the same teachers. And of course, I really appreciate the Academy and a lot of this doing. I have to confess, I haven't seen all of your videos that you have on your channel, but obviously I follow along and I am aware of the publications you've had. And I believe it's very important that we engage in very frank dialogue. I know some people are a little bit hesitant to engage in dialogue. I'm not that type of person. Whether we like it or not, there are views out there in the academy about the faith that obviously Muslims are going to find problematic. That is the reality. We can't just ignore those views. We have to engage with them in a manner that demonstrates we have a robust tradition. We're able to defend. I know for a fact some of the people you have on your channel, they have views that I strongly disagree with, so obviously me coming on your channel does not endorse their views. That's their views. I'm going to present my views and we're going to engage in dialogue. And I want to just make clear for the record that perhaps 100, 200 years ago, it would make sense for faith communities to be isolated from one another. But the world we live in now, isolation is not healthy and it's not going to protect. A lot of people kick into a defensive mechanism of not wanting to engage with the other. I just don't think that's the way forward, even if we disagree. And I'm sure the two of us disagree on some things as well. So it is what it is. But we have to engage in a manner that demonstrates what exactly we believe, why we believe it. We empathize with the other view insofar as it's coming from a constructed argument that is logical. And if it's not, it's our job to, deconstruct it. That's exactly what these dialogues are about. So I'm very happy to be interviewed by you to present my presentation. And hopefully this is going to further the conversation, not just about the verse of Mithaq, but also about Ibn Taymiyya, which is really the focus of today's talk.
Great, terrific. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Qadhi. First of all, for being here. And you're right. This opportunity to speak together does represent sort of bridge building in a way, because there are different communities interested in the Quran that might come together to watch this video. So that's terrific. And of course, we encourage people in the comments to have a really constructive and respectful conversation. So please keep that in mind. But in another way, we're natural conversation partners. As you say, we studied both at Yale and with the same Professor Gerhard Bövring there at Yale. And and on an academic level, one of the beauties of the academy is people are able to form bonds, even if they're coming from different places, over sort of rigorous conversation. And as you say, we sharpen each other, we correct each other when there is something less than rigorous in our thought. I'm going to go ahead and read a very short introduction. Friends, you probably know, most viewers will know, a very long introduction would also be possible. But Dr. Qadhi is very gracious and humble and just sent along a very short introduction. His accomplishments are well known. He's an internationally known speaker, respected in the academy and academic circles, also within the Islamic world and Muslim faith communities. So this is a really special opportunity for me. So I really appreciate that. So everyone, Dr. Qadhi was born and raised in Houston, Texas, did a bachelor's in chemical engineering and had some background working in the field of chemicals, and then studied for 10 years at the University of Medina in Saudi Arabia. And I have a note here that you were the first American non-convert graduate of the University of Medina. That's right?
That is correct. Yes, there were around 17, 18 before me that had studied, but they were converts. So I was born and raised as a Muslim in America, and then went to study there. So the first, yeah.
Right. Okay. So we did both a BA in Hadith and an MA in Theology at the University of Medina, and then came to New Haven, Connecticut, where we got to know each other, and studied a PhD in Islamic Studies in the Department of Religious Studies, again from Yale. Dr. Qadhi is currently the Dean of the Islamic Seminary of America and was recently appointed Chair of the Fiqh Council of North America. I wanted to ask some follow-ups on those too, so that our viewers can get to know some of your work. But also, it's a way of understanding more the Muslim American community and the work that's going on to develop both thoughtful conversations within the community and building bridges between Muslim communities and other Muslim communities. So, starting with the Islamic Seminary of America, could you introduce us a bit to the institution and your work there?
Sure. So the Islamic Seminary of America is a project that a number of leading intellectuals were thinking about for the last decade. I actually joined it 8 years ago, 7 years ago, the concept, the idea. It's been operating, for 4 years now. And the Islamic Seminary of America is the first of its kind. It is about to be accredited. It is a master's or graduate level seminary. And it aims to produce thought leaders and movers and shakers, and also to traverse the two traditions of the Madrasa and the academy.
Right.
We are faith-based thinkers. We're a seminary. We are a seminary, but at the same time, we're not a seminary that shies away from engaging with modernity, from engaging with the academy. And so we are, committed Muslims, but we're also aware that to be committed Muslims in the modern world requires, at times, reinvestigation, at times, reflections that perhaps would be very awkward conversations in the pure madrasas, in the more, traditional mainstream. And again, I come from one, so I'm very familiar with the do's and don'ts and the red lines. We don't have the liberty of having such red lines in the modern world. And so we are a faith-based academic training seminary that engages not only with the classical tradition, but also with the modern problems that the academy and the modern questions and the modern controversies that the academy brings in a manner that we, dare I say, I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I don't think any other place in the world would have that unique combination of a commitment to the faith and a willingness to engage with some of the most difficult questions. We've read some of your stuff, by the way, in the seminary, and again, some of your writings about the Quran are obviously interesting to say the least, and they do raise a lot of questions that we have to deal with. So that's that type of thought process where we're happy to say the Islamic Seminary is at the forefront of that integration.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And you do work as well on fiqh. I have a larger, more broad question about the life of American Muslims and negotiating life as a faithful Muslim and how to think through questions of jurisprudence. So I don't know if you want to enter into that a little bit. What are some of the particular challenges of living as a Muslim in a society like America that is not majority Muslim? But maybe you can also introduce us to the work of the Fiqh Council of North America.
That's a lecture in and of itself, Gabriel. We have multiple problems. Of them is basically the free-for-all. There's no leadership that is universally agreed upon, and there is a free market. Now, of course, that's a lot of pros and cons. I'd much rather have this than a dictatorship or a dynasty telling me this is the Grand Mufti I have to follow. You know what I'm saying? I'd much rather have the American scene. But the American scene, obviously, and the Western world overall, it does present a dilemma for the average lay Muslim. The average lay Muslim has a full free-for-all market of ideas and religious authorities. And so in his or her own good conscience, they need to make a choice. Who am I going to take as my reference point, right? And in the competition of ideas, generally speaking, sometimes the best idea doesn't necessarily, win the most. And it's not a matter of winning. It's a matter of, trying to be faithful to the tradition. Again, similarly with the Islamic Seminary, faithful to the tradition, even as we engage with modernity. So the Fiqh Council of North America is the oldest And the first such body of its type, it goes back, the origins go back to the 60s and 70s. It was officially formed in 1980, 81. And it is the oldest such council where a group of scholars and clerics, all based in America, come together to discuss issues of a modern nature. So for example, I mean, obviously one of the biggest issues for Muslims is how to engage with the economic system, with banks, with mortgages.
Right,
These are
right,
very difficult questions for Muslims.
right,
Like, how does one exactly live in America?
right.
And the entire system is based upon certain values that are generally antithetical to our faith.
Because of,
Another
just to clarify for any maybe viewers who are not familiar with the issue there, because of the question of riba, or
riba, interest. Yeah,
generally question of translated as interest, which creates
yeah.
a challenge and an opportunity for new ways of thinking about banking and all of that.
Yep, exactly. So a recent fatwa that I wrote, for example, is about Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin permissible or not? These are like these are controversies that take place. Another fatwa that I was also drafted to write was about the LGBT issue. Like, how does one balance the commitment to our faith with the modern realities of living in a world where there are different moralities and different sexualities? So again, there's these really difficult questions, and the Fiqh Council occupies a place on a spectrum of interpretation. We consider ourselves to be in the middle, obviously, but everybody does, but we consider ourselves to be in the middle, not too literalist or fundamentalist, and not too radical revisionist either, right? We do have respect for our tradition, but we are not wed to the tradition. The tradition, in the end of the day, is something we come from and we respect. But just because there is precedent doesn't mean we need to stick with it. When are we allowed to break away from precedent? That's a question that, it's an internal question amongst clerics, right?
Right.
What exactly does it mean to be a Muslim in the modern world, where values are different? We're living under democracy, we're living under a secular system. So these are very difficult questions. In the end of the day, we are one council out of many, but we do have the privilege, I would like to say, of being the first such council, and of being one of the most reputable, if not the most reputable. Again, the most reputable is a judgment call. It depends on who you ask, right? But definitely we are the first, and definitely the most established and the oldest such fiqh council. And I was humbled last week to it wasn't something on my agenda radar, but they appointed me the chair, and so that's one of my responsibilities now as well.
Congratulations, and
Thank you.
one more task to be attentive to among
Exactly.
many others that you're negotiating. So yeah, and maybe I just add a very brief comment about that. In terms of my teaching at Notre Dame, we have mostly Catholic students, about 3/4, 60%, 70% Catholic students at Notre Dame. And two things that I try to inculcate with my students when speaking about Islam. One is to develop at least an appreciation, if not admiration, for the Muslim concern and the Jewish concern with jurisprudence, which can be difficult for Christian students to see law positively and the zeal to follow the law positively. But the second is also to actually to learn from the Muslim example, even the effort to be faithful. Obviously, fiqh is a quest that is never ending. You're always thinking through new questions and thinking through new solutions. But I think non-Muslims can look to that and find in their own tradition ways of being more faithful to their own tradition. So yeah, so it's very interesting also for non-Muslims to observe the formation of groups like the Islamic Seminary and Fiqh Council. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I don't know if you want to add anything more. I mean, something that I admire about you, Yasir, is you negotiate both really serious, rigorous academic scholarship that uses the methods of the academic tradition in understanding religion and texts, including scripture. But then you also do what we might call confessional, or maybe better, constructive scholarship, which seeks to nourish the faith lives of believers. Is that difficult, negotiating those two together?
It was difficult at the very beginning. When I started my training at Yale, I needed to understand the division between the two worlds. But and you were there when I began, so we knew each other from my very first year. But ever since, understanding the dynamics and the usul, the paradigms of the two, I've never had an issue personally, because I've learned to understand what my theology and faith demands of me, and the usul or the paradigm of the academy. And I don't really have a personal, issue balancing the two anymore. However, the same cannot be said of people on both sides of the aisle, right? So I have had slight or perhaps harsh backlash from both sides of the aisle about what I do on the other side, and so the academy has at times problematized some of my moral stances, right? Some of my theological views that are online, nothing to do with the academy. And sometimes as well, many Muslims don't understand how I could be seeing, breaking bread with people they think have, heretical views, and
Right.
maybe they do from that paradigm, but I have to engage with the ideas. I have to deal with, the realities of that world. So yeah, it's awkward for people on both sides that are listening to me. Me personally, I have never, ever since the first year or two, I've never had an issue, trying to understand each side of the aisle. As you were, I taught at Rhodes College for a decade, and I
Yes,
was the
of course.
imam of the Memphis Islamic Center. So for 10 years, I was literally the professor of Islamic Studies, in a very, prestigious, very nice university, and the imam of the largest masjid in Memphis for 10 years, doing both at the same time. I
Yes.
never had an issue, balancing that. I wear different caps, and I'm very happy at that. But yeah, I mean, certain people sometimes do problematize the other side.
Yeah. Well, let's transition right to our principal topic, which is an academic one.
تفضل
But
بسم
we'll be dealing with some of the superstars of the Islamic tradition. So we're going to be speaking, and you'll be sharing with us a presentation on what is sometimes called the verse of the Mithaq, or the
الله.
verse of the covenant, although the word covenant is not in there in the verse itself. But I mean, it's become known that at least in Western conversation, I think sometimes it's referred to as the verse of Alest in the Islamic tradition because of
Yep.
the words
يوم
God.
ألست.
Yes. So for everyone who is not familiar with this verse, I'll go ahead and read it in English. But we'll have an opportunity to speak about the Arabic words as well. Sometimes spoken of as a primordial covenant. Quran in Surah Al-A'raf, which is Surah 7, says, when your Lord took from the children of Adam from their loins their descendants and made them bear witness over themselves, saying, am I not your Lord? They said, yes, indeed, we bear witness. Lest you should, so now that's the end of the quotation from the Souls, lest you should say on the day of resurrection, quote, indeed, we were unaware of this. And then the following verse is also connected to it. I don't know if you want to introduce us maybe, Yasir, generally to the verse before we enter into some of the debates around it.
Yeah, I have it in the slide. So can I share my screen now?
You
Is that
should be able to.
okay? Let me see. Okay, can you see the screen?
It's looking good. Yeah,
Okay,
if
yeah.
you go into presentation mode, then the whole screen will show the PowerPoints.
Okay, so before I do that, I just wanted to quickly show some audio as well, and then I'll do the presentation mode. So today's presentation is about Ibn Taymiyya and the verse of the Mithaq. And Ibn Taymiyya has a really interesting take on the verse, which one would assume is atypical of Ibn Taymiyya. And so in my brief presentation, I talked about this in my PhD in a lot more detail. I've also presented at academic conferences about this particular issue, and again, a lot more detail. So this is a summary of a much larger research, and I'm going to have to cut back a lot of stuff because of the time. However, let us begin with the verse of the Mithaq. And of course, let me bring in a little bit of the confessional side here. And because I'm a lover of the Quran, I've memorized the Quran, I have ijazat in the Quran, I love to listen to the Quran. So let me bring in a little bit of the confessional side, which I wouldn't have done unless there's somebody like you, Gabriel, who knows me very well. And let's just might as well listen. View presentation mode, right? Is that better now? Nope, that's not better. Sorry. Let me do,
I think
here we go.
there we go. Perfect.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Now, so the verse of the Mithaq is Surah Al-A'raf, verse 172. And it comes after the story of Moses and one of the longest sections of the Quran about Moses and the children of Israel. And the Quran says, وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ مِنْ بَنِي آدَمَ مِنْ ظُهُورِهِمْ. Recall when your Lord brought forth from the children of Adam, from their loins, ذُرِّيَّتَهُمْ, their progeny, their descendants, وَأَشْهَدَهُمْ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ, and he had them testify against themselves or regarding themselves. أشهد على, you can testify for or testify against. أشهدهم على أنفسهم. So he caused them to testify on themselves, regarding themselves. ألست بربكم. This is a rhetorical question in the first person. Am I not your God? Am I not your Lord? ألست بربكم? قالوا بلى. They replied, yes. شهدنا, we testify. أن تقولوا, he cautioned, somebody cautioned, the angels cautioned, or qadar is cautioning, or the predestination is cautioning, right? أن تقولوا يوم القيامة إن كنا عن هذا غافلين. So that you would not have the right to say. Now you cannot say on the day of judgment, we didn't know you were our God. We didn't know who was our God. We were unaware of the reality of lordship. So this is a verse that has been called the verse of the mithaq, the verse of the covenant. Now, the verse itself is an extremely deep and profound verse. It has been interpreted so many different ways by so many different people. It is called Yawm Alas, the day of Alastu, am I not? In Persian, it is called Ruzi Alas, the day of Alas. It is also called the Ayatul Mithaq, the verse of the covenant. The reason why it's called the verse of the covenant is because hadith literature, Sunni hadith literature, mentions and interprets this verse and says that your Lord took أخذ ربك ميثاق. Your Lord took a mithaq, means a strong covenant from the children of Adam. So this is called the day or the verse of the mithaq. Now, before we get to Ibn Taymiyya, very quickly, what are the pre-Ibn Taymiyyan mainstream standard Sunni hadith-based, literalist-based, Ahl al-Hadith-based interpretations of the verse? Again, a quick sampling. At-Tabari, who is the dawn of Athari, Tafsir, he is the giant, the encyclopedia. Ibn Taymiyya loves At-Tabari. He goes, it's the best tafsir ever written. At-Tabari has a staggering 10 pages of, and this is like literally of the massive volume here. This is like the big volume of At-Tabari. Literally, he's got like 10 pages, 40 reports of Ibn Abbas and Abu Hurairah and Umar and so many companions and so many of the students of the companions, which presents a very vivid picture. This is an actual extraction. God from Adam, from one person, Adam, God extracted all of mankind. And God spoke directly to the souls of mankind. This took place on earth. This took place before our births, before me and your births. There was an existence before our existence. And that existence is the birth of the soul. And so this takes place when God sends Adam down to the earth. One of the first things he does is he extracts from Adam all of the children of Adam, and he testifies, or he causes them to testify. He tells them, am I not your Lord? The rhetorical question, am I not your Lord? And they respond, yes, we accept you are our Lord. We know you are our Lord. So At-Tabari is very clear. There is no other interpretation. This is an actual covenant, an actual extraction, an actual live, incident taking place, and God speaks to mankind, and mankind responds to God. And this mithaq, or this covenant, is now embedded in the psyche of man, not the psyche, the psyche of man, in the subconsciousness of man. Ibn Abdul Barr as well, the great Andalusian scholar, again, and Ibn Taymiyya loves him, quotes him all the time. Ibn Abdul Barr also has a very extensive commentary in the Muwatta of Imam Malik when he has his Tamheed. He talks about this reality, and Ibn Taymiyya quotes him. Ibn Taymiyya is well aware of Ibn Abdul Barr's interpretation. Al-Wahidi, again, one of the icons of Athari Tafsir, his 30 volumes of Tafsir al-Basit, which has just been recently published. Again, Al-Wahidi is very explicit in this regard, and he mentions that the Ahlul Athar, the Mufassirin, the Ahlul Ilm, that's what he calls them. Basically, all of the people worthy to follow, they said an actual extraction takes place, and there's an actual covenant. Then he quickly says, as for the Ashabul Ma'ani, those that don't care about the Athar, those that don't care about ilm and the real Mufassir, these are pseudo-intellectuals. As for the Ashabul Ma'ani, they say this is metaphorical. And then he goes on, right? So again, Al-Wahidi is saying there's an actual extraction and an actual conversation, and this is the default of the Mufassirun and the Ahlul Ilm and the Ahlul Athar. Athar means those who are following the reports. Imam al-Baghawi is the same. Ibn Atiyya, he concedes that a metaphorical interpretation could be linguistically possible. But then he goes, but then this interpretation contradicts, and then he says mutawatir, like it has been narrated by too many people, reports from the Prophet ﷺ that indicates an actual covenant. So Ibn Atiyya says, you know what, if there were no hadith at all, then maybe the verse is symbolic. Maybe there's no actual extraction, and you can interpret it to be something else. What that something else is, we'll talk about on the next slide. But he says we can't do that because there's just too many reports to do this, right? Ibn al-Jawzi as well, in his famous Tafsir, he lists a number of athar, and he lists a number of reports that indicate the actual covenant. But then he goes, but there is a Zajjaj, one of the early commentators who wasn't really known to be a part of the Athari school per se. He goes, as Zajjaj says, this is a interpretation. This is a symbolic covenant. It's not an actual covenant. Now we can go on, but the summary is the default position of pre-Sunni scholars of tafsir who emphasize the tradition, who emphasize the narrations, who emphasize hadith, is that an actual extraction took place, an actual conversation, an actual scenario takes place in which God speaks to mankind. This is pretty much the default position pre Ibn Taymiyya of those who followed basically the Athari school, or the Hanbali, or Hanbali theologically for the advanced students, not Hanbali fiqh wise. Basically pre Ibn Taymiyya types of understandings of Islam. Now there has been an alternative opinion pre Ibn Taymiyya, and that is found by the Mu'tazilites and by some of the Ash'arites. The Mu'tazilites, Zamakhshari is the main one I'm going to quote here, but again, there's others as well. The Mu'tazilites, Zamakhshari in his Kashaf says that, this verse, it's min bab al-tamthili wa takhyil, right? This is literally what he says, right? That it's a type of metaphor. It's like imagery, takhil. It's like imagination. It's not actual. There was no actual extraction, right? And what the verse implies is nasb al-adillati shahidati ala sihhatiha al-uqul, that God gave us brains, God gave us minds. So this is not an actual covenant. No, there's no conversation taking place. No, the verse is saying metaphorically that God gave us minds to think, and he gave us evidences in the world around us that conform with the minds that Allah has given us, that God has given us, right? And so as Zamakhshari is saying, there was no actual covenant. No, there's no mithaq taking place. Rather, this is a symbolism of the intellect, the human intellect. And God is saying that he has blessed us with the brains to think, to rationalize, and he's given us all the evidences to know he is one. And Fakhruddin al-Razi, who is Ibn Taymiyya's nemesis, Ibn Taymiyya's main interlocutor in a number of books, Ibn Taymiyya really took al-Razi to be like one of the main points of contention. And interestingly enough, side point here, he almost ignores Ghazali. We emphasize Ghazali a lot. Ibn Taymiyya kind of sort of sidelines him. It's like not a big guy for him. It's al-Razi who is like the heavyweight for Ibn Taymiyya. He hardly mentioned Ghazali, by the way. Interesting. I actually have a paper I was writing. If God gives me time, I'll try to finish it up. Ibn Taymiyya and his position on Ghazali. But al-Razi is the big guy, right? The entire Dar al-Ta'arud, like the 10-volume my PhD was on, right? The entire Dar al-Ta'arud is a refutation of al-Razi. 10 volumes refuting al-Razi. And al-Razi concedes in this verse, when he comments on it in his, the famous, the Tafsir al-Kabir of Fakhruddin al-Razi, al-Razi basically says that we know that the Mufassirun and the Ahlul Athar have interpreted a literal extraction. We know this, that's their version, right? But then he goes over, this is batil, like this is impossible to be the case. And then he goes for 12 reasons. 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't have time to go into those 12, but feel free to read directly from his Tafsir al-Kabir. He goes for 12 reasons this cannot have taken place. And then he says, so the real interpretation, which is the interpretation of the people of reflection, Ahlul Nazar, right? Wa arbab al-uqul, and the people and the masters of intellect, is that this verse implies that God, basically Zamakhshari's, that God gave evidences to mankind, and he gave them a sound intellect to understand those evidences, okay? So basically, Zamakhshari and al-Razi come to the same conclusion, even though Razi never quotes Zamakhshari, actually he's using some of the same principles and even the same evidences as the Zamakhshari, okay? So before we get to Ibn Taymiyyah, we clearly now have the mainstream Sunni trajectory, When I say Sunni here, I mean the Ahlul Athar, the following the traditions, following the Sahaba Tabi'un, the reports of the past. And we have explicit narrations that this is the default position, even from Al-Razi and Al-Baghawi and others, that they say, look, this is, and Al-Baghawi and others mention, what am I saying here? Sorry. Ibn Atiyya mentions that we might have the possibility to interpret it another way, but we can't because there's mutawatir reports, right? So now we get to Ibn Taymiyyah, and this is super interesting because one would assume the stereotype people have of Ibn Taymiyyah is that how dare you go against the mutawatir reports? How can you possibly, go against the default position of the Mufassirun and the Ahl al-Athar? So he too would affirm an actual covenant. But no, in his Dar al-Ta'arud, which I've summarized in my PhD, my PhD was about Dar al-Ta'arud, right? So in his Dar al-Ta'arud, he actually, really interestingly enough, adopts the position of Zamakhshari and Al-Razi, adopts it with a modification, as we'll see. Okay.
Can I jump in, Yasir, with one just small
Sure.
point of clarification? Could you just translate the full title of Dar al-Ta'arud, because people might not know the Arabic, because it pertains to this. Yeah.
Averting the conflict, averting the potential conflict between reason and revelation. Okay. Averting the conflict between reason and revelation. So Ibn Taymiyyah wrote, I would say, his magnum opus, and multiple people have said this is his magnum opus. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote his 10-volume theological treatise about how to reconcile faith with intellect, faith with logic and reason. And he took Al-Razi as an interlocutor. He used Al-Razi to be, the nemesis, the arch nemesis, for the entire book, basically. And then through Al-Razi, he jumps to basically the Mu'tazilas and the Falasif and whatnot. But point being that in this book, Ibn Taymiyyah, by and large, defends the tradition against the rationalists, the Mu'tazilites, and the Mutakallimun, the scholars of Kalam, right? And obviously, from his perspective, it's devastating. Now, we get to this issue of the mithaq, of the covenant. And really interesting, Ibn Taymiyyah actually denies that there was an actual covenant. And he agrees with a very important caveat, he ends up agreeing with the scholars that he generally refutes in the rest of the book. And he basically says that neither the Quran nor the authentic Sunnah indicates mankind actually spoke. Rather, God's extraction indicates he created them generation after generation. And their testimony is that he ingrained in them the faculties to know his lordship. Okay, this is basically Zamakhshari. This is basically Al-Razi, exactly, right? And he says here, now, but what's the caveat? What's the difference? The difference is that, and I quote from Dar al-Ta'arud, so they have in their fitrah, what is the fitrah? We'll come to this in a while. What allows them to verify that God alone is their Lord. And they have inherent within them what demonstrates the erroneousness of worshiping other than God. Now, the big caveat, the big difference for Al-Razi, for Az-Zamakhshari, for the scholars of Kalam and the Falasifa even and others, the verse of the Mithaq is yet another validation of the superiority of the intellect over all else. And God is saying to mankind, I've given you the brains that you can use to think, I've given you the mind, and I've given you the signs around to recognize, the truth. Okay, so they interpret this verse. There is no mithaq. They don't call it the verse of the mithaq, right? That's what the Sunnis say. That's what the Athari say. The scholars of the Athar say. This is the verse of the mithaq. Zamakhshari doesn't call it the verse of the mithaq. There is no mithaq. For them and Al-Razi, what this verse is yet another indication of the superiority of the aql over anything else. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah, here's the key point here, utilizes the same arguments, employs the same hermeneutics, brings in some of the exact same lines of poetry that Az-Zamakhshari has, which I don't get into in my slides, to come to a conclusion with one key difference. And that difference is, instead of aql, you have the fitrah. This is the key difference here. Now, what exactly is the fitrah? The fitra is, of course, an entire discussion altogether. I do have some lectures on it on my YouTube channel if you have time to listen, and it's also part of my dissertation. I mean, 150 pages of my, or 100 pages of my dissertation, more than 100, was about the fitra. That was one of the main points of my dissertation, Ibn Taymiyya's utilization of the fitra. For Ibn Taymiyya, here's the key point. The fitra is another faculty. Just like we had the faculties of hearing and seeing and sense and intellect, Ibn Taymiyya utilized a concept that is referenced in the Quran, it's referenced in the Sunnah, but no theologian before Ibn Taymiyya created an entire faculty out of this concept. Ibn Taymiyya is the first theologian in Islamic history, to the best of my research and knowledge, to construct an entire theology, an entire epistemology around the notion of fitra. And for Ibn Taymiyya, here's the key point. The fitra is something that is more primordial and less susceptible to corruption than the human intellect. And the fitra keeps the intellect in check. He wants a faculty that shall keep the faculties of the scholars of kalam in check, right? He wants to have, who's going to check the checkers, who's going to, teach the teachers, who's going to be in charge of the intellect. Ibn Taymiyya says the fitra is in charge of the intellect. And the fitra, which is embodied, it is ingrained in mankind. It is a faculty that is deeper than even the intellect, and it is less susceptible to corruption, and hence the fitra will know intuitively. Sometimes the brain doesn't recognize, the fitra will recognize. And so for Ibn Taymiyya, the verse is about the fitra. Now very quickly, how does he prove this? Because the verse seems to be very clear, right, in this regard. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just affirming what you're saying. The verse does, I mean, the exoteric, outer meaning of the verse seems to be clear. So yeah, I'm very intrigued about how he negotiates this.
It's not just the outer meaning, more explicit. If you read At-Tabari's 10 pages, like 40 narrations, right? There is just, and At-Tabari doesn't even present two opinions. Like Tabari usually says there's two opinions, three opinions. Right. In this case, it's just like, this is it. And he brings like an entire corpus of athar from multiple sahaba, multiple tabi'un, multiple people of the past, right? Again, for those who know Ibn Taymiyya, this is an open shut case. Like once you have precedents from the sahaba and tabi'un, once you have the athar or the narration speaking, and that's Ibn Taymiyya's point all the time, that when you have, the authentic, Quran and Sunnah, intellect cannot possibly overrule the Quran and Sunnah. Right? Now, what does he do in this regard? So he firstly sidelines the issue of tawatur and ijma' completely. He doesn't ijma' of the Ahl al-Athar, which is mentioned by a number of people. Ibn Atiyah and others mention this. He just sidelines.
So ijma' meaning consensus, just to clarify.
The consensus of the people of one strand of Sunnism. So for Ibn Taymiyya, the Salaf's consensus is a binding argument. Ibn Taymiyya always says this, right? The Salaf's consensus, the Salaf are the early scholars, the first 2-3 generations of Sunni Islam. For Ibn Taymiyya, their consensus is binding. And for Ibn Taymiyya, tawatur is also, like tawatur is, numerous reports, is also an evidence that cannot be rejected. He actually simply bypasses the issue of tawatur and the issue of the fact that all earlier scholars from that one strand interpreted in this manner. And he begins the discussion by saying, there are two opinions on this issue. There are two opinions. And it's interesting because the other opinion does not come from the Salaf. It doesn't come from Ahl al-Athar. It comes from the Mu'tazila. But he goes, there's two opinions. And then what to do about these 40 plus narrations, what to do about all of these, quotes. He goes over them one by one. And he either says, number one, that they're not authentic in the isnad, the chain of narrators, so it can't be used. Or number two, it's not explicit, there's an actual conversation taking place, right? So either they are not sahih or they're not sarih. Either they're not authentic or they're ambiguous, and you can interpret them multiple ways. And again, this is ingenious, like going over one by one, and he rarely does this for any other issue, but essentially by the end of these 5-10 pages, he's dismissed all the reports. Like all these reports, they don't count one by one, okay? Then he says, there's no evidence that an actual covenant took place, nothing from the Quran and Sunnah, right? And then he goes back to the verse itself. And again, this is technical here, but if you look at the verse here, remember when your Lord took from the children of Adam, min bani Adam. Ibn Taymiyyah says, and this is exactly what the scholars of Kalam and the Mu'tazila said, this is not from Adam. This is from the children of Adam, right? And he extracted from them their children, their dhurriyyah, their progeny. So for Ibn Taymiyya, this is the generations of mankind, one after the other. This isn't a one-off, all of mankind. This is a reference to God allowing mankind to procreate and having another generation. Then that generation comes of age and has another generation. And then that generation comes of age. This is the continuity of the genealogical realities of birth and life and death. That's what Ibn Taymiyyah did. And this is exactly what the Mu'tazila said as well. Right? This is not found in At-Tabari, this is not found in Ibn Atiyah. This is like looking at the verse itself. Ibn Taymiyyah says that God is speaking that from every generation he extracts their dhurriyyah, their progeny, right? So then he brings in a logical argument, and this is like truly amazing, then he goes, even from a rational standpoint, it doesn't make sense for testimony to be taken from somebody against that same somebody. You don't take testimony from somebody for or against somebody. You take it from a third party, right? And again, this is Zamakhshari says this, right? This is a purely Mu'tazilite argument, which is a logical and rational argument, which again, for those who know Ibn Taymiyyah, to use a rational argument against the athar, this is like alarm bell should be going off, right? But here we have Ibn Taymiyyah saying, you can't use somebody to testify. And that's what the verse is saying, that ashhadahum ala anfusihim. So he is saying, this is not a testimony of a verbal nature. No, it can't be, because logically, you don't take a testimony for somebody against that same somebody, right? You need a third party to testify. You need a neutral party to testify. And so he said that this testimony doesn't have to be verbal. It can be by one's state, one's hal. And here the testimony is their pure state of how God created them upon the pure fitrah. That is their testimony, right? And so he says that, therefore, the verse is not about an actual extraction and an actual covenant and an actual back and forth. Rather, the verse is saying God has gifted mankind with an innate ability, with an inherent cognizance that God exists and God is worthy of worship and God is the Lord. This is his understanding of the verse. Now, to conclude, final two slides here.
Right.
For the mutakallimun, the scholars of Kalam, philosophy, Mu'tazila, the verse of the Mithaq is a reference to the power, role, and efficacy of the intellect, aql. But for Ibn Taymiyyah, the verse is about a faculty that is even more powerful, even more deeply ingrained, and hence less susceptible to corruption, because the fitrah is not acquired for Ibn Taymiyyah. As for the intellect, it is acquired. You learn stuff, you learn things, right? The fitrah is gifted to you from birth. This is what Ibn Taymiyyah says, quoting the Quran and Sunnah. The fitrah is innate. The fitrah is inherent. And therefore, the fitrah is a faculty that is capable of keeping the role of the intellect in check. It is more powerful than the intellect, right? And so Ibn Taymiyyah uses this verse for the fitrah. And therefore, the reason for this, of course, is that Ibn Taymiyyah wanted to essentially deprive the Mu'tazila and the Mutakallimun of attempting to use this verse to support their claim that the intellect is the greatest gift that has been given to mankind. Ibn Taymiyyah felt that the intellect is extremely finicky, susceptible to corruption. Ibn Taymiyyah wanted to strip them from the efficacy of their claim that their version of the intellect, again, this is the key point here, their version of the intellect is the primary source of ethics and laws and theology. And so he says this verse is about the fitrah, not about the aql. In doing so, he accomplishes two things. Number one, he gets rid of their interpretation, their arsenal of trying to prove the aql, to prove the supremacy of the intellect. And number two, he adds something to his own already ever-growing repertoire of trying to prove the fitrah. Because again, we don't have time to get into all of there, but for Ibn Taymiyyah, the fitrah, I guess I have to mention this. The fitrah proves God's existence to such a level that you do not need intellectual proofs per se for the existence of God. That's the key point here. Because Ibn Taymiyyah was very much against the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. Ibn Taymiyyah was very much against Ibn Sina's, 5 proofs for the existence of God. He felt all of these proofs were superfluous and caused more harm than good. Now, what's the alternative then, O Ibn Taymiyyah? How do we know God exists? Don't we need the aql? And here comes the fitrah. No, you don't need the aql to prove God's existence. The aql is used for other areas. You don't need the intellect for any of these proofs because you have the fitrah. So conclusion here, therefore, and there's a su'al and jawab here. The conclusion, therefore, is that for Ibn Taymiyyah, this verse was an evidence that God has given in mankind, blessed mankind with an innate ability from the very beginning of creation. It's embedded in mankind, and every generation is born with that innate ability, and that innate ability supersedes, it is more efficacious than even the human intellect, and therefore this verse has nothing to do with an actual covenant. It rather has to do with the fact that man is blessed with that concept of the fitrah that can keep the aql in check. And with that, I can have some discussion or Q&A for you.
Thank you, Dr. Qadhi. I have a few follow-up questions. If you still have time and energy, is that okay if I ask a couple follow-up questions?
Sure.
Yeah, this is terrific because, I mean, among other things, it complicates a simplistic vision that beginning students or maybe people sort of on the margins of Islamic studies may have about Ibn Taymiyyah, that he only represents one way of thinking through questions in regard to Quran and Hadith, that he only sides with a certain team, that he doesn't have sort of the nimbleness to think in an original and creative way over particular issues. So yeah, it's a great example to show, in fact, how nuanced and complicated Ibn Taymiyyah's thought is, and the Islamic intellectual tradition and engagement with the Quran is. So that's, yeah, thank you so much for that. Okay, one immediate question that's related to fitrah. So the most famous verse of the fitrah may be in Surah Ar-Rum. Is that right?
Fitrat Allah allati fatara an-nas 'alayha. Yep.
Yeah, so in Surah 30.
The fitrah that mankind created. Yep, that's 30, yeah.
And often understood, and you can, open to your correction, to mean that the Quran there is alluding to God instilling in humankind from their very creation something like an instinct. I think sometimes the Arabic word ghariza is used as a sort of synonym for it, but some sort of instinct which naturally leads humans to obey God and believe in God. You've worked on this a lot, so again, we could have a long talk about this. But my particular question is, in light of Ibn Taymiyyah's view that the fitrah is really what's at stake in the verse of the covenant in Quran 7:172, does that imply, and would he agree then, that the principal role of the prophets, who are given to humanity as a mercy from God, is not so much to impart new information that might lead to belief and salvation, but to remind humans of things that they should know because of the fitrah?
Good point here. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the fitrah is, he gives an analogy to this, like the fitrah is like the uncorrupted eye, and the revelation from God is like the sun. So the eye can appreciate the beauty and the light of the sun. So when you have eyes, you can see the light, you can see the sun, right? So the fitrah can recognize the truth of the prophets as vividly and as clearly as the eyes can see the light during the day, right? However, the prophets do come with more knowledge than the fitrah provides.
Okay.
No doubt about that. They do come with more knowledge, but they validate what the fitrah provides. And the pure fitrah can recognize the veracity of the prophets instantaneously. That's the key point here. And also the knowledge of the fitrah. So Ibn Taymiyyah never actually has a detailed discussion like this is what the fitrah says and this is what the aql says. No, but I've extracted quite a lot in the dissertation. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the fitrah gives us basic necessary knowledge of God's oneness, God's perfection, God's existence, God's right to be worshipped. the fitra finds comfort in worshiping God. So there's an element of spirituality. The fitra knows the basics of morality, but not the details of morality. And so conscience, right? When you lie, when you steal, when you cheat, the fitra knows you're not supposed to do that. That's why you feel guilty, right? So for Ibn Taymiyyah, it's actually a theological faculty, a psychological faculty, a spiritual faculty, all combined in one.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, great. And for a second follow-up question, and maybe we'll bring Ibn Taymiyyah in here again, but it's more about the verse itself. And here I'd like to speak about another Qadhi, Wadad al-Qadhi, former professor of the University of Chicago. So she wrote an article, which I believe is more or less the transcript of a lecture she gave to the American Philosophical Association.
Yes.
It was published, freely available online for those who are interested. The article is entitled "The Primordial Covenant." That's how she refers to this verse, and human history in the Quran. Maybe she gives something away by titling the article "Primordial Covenant," because she does advocate for the more literal interpretation of this verse, that it is alluding to a real moment, as you said in your presentation, before or after the creation of Adam and his descent or fall to earth, or entrance into earth, but then before the creation of the rest of his descendants. So she brings in this another verse, which she speaks about the verse of the trust, or the amana, in which she discusses, this is Quran 33:72. She discusses them together, and that's where, I'm sure you know the verse well and could probably recite it for us, but that's where God offers the trust to the mountains and to other natural features, and then only humans finally take upon themselves this amana, this trust. So she brings these two verses together, and she says, I'll just quote a bit from the article here. I'll be interested in your response, especially about one point. She says, according to them, thus, the two verses, them is the exegetes, the mufassirun. According to them, thus, the two verses in the Quran that refer to man's formative stage and pre-existence make man's obedience to God the fundamental element that governs the relationship between man and God. So that's one point. So obedience is sort of the principal duty or responsibility of humans in regard to God. And then she continues, furthermore, both verses insinuate that this situation is an ideal one that is difficult for man to sustain, and they point to the strong likelihood of a departure from this ideal. So that's really what I want to get your thoughts on. I mean, would you agree with that assessment, that the Amana verse in the verse of the covenant, so-called verse of the covenant, speak to the difficulty of humanity's obedience to God? Would you say this is the Quranic approach more generally in regard to humans' disposition and the struggles they have to obey God?
So that is, of course, an interpretation. Firstly, the correlation between the Mithaq verse and the Amana verse, it is up for grabs. You will have an entire spectrum. Okay. And I don't think Ibn Taymiyyah correlated between the two. Okay. And in all likelihood, and even mainstream Sunnis would actually, meaning like people like Al-Baghawi, Ibn Ati, and others, they would view this as two separate things. So even so, those who interpreted an actual mithaq, right, that is not the amana. That's something else. The amana is the fact that now what exactly is the amana depends on which interpretation you follow. Many would say this was the opportunity to be different from the other creations, the opportunity to have the eternal salvation of God, the potential for salvation, which comes with the risk of punishment, right?
Which is distinctive to humanity, right? This somehow distinguishes humans as rational creatures from all other created.
Exactly. So so obviously the scholars of Kalam would also interpret this as rationality, the benefits of rationality, whereas the scholars of the Athar or the others would say this is simply a privilege given to mankind, that he has the potential to have everlasting life in God's pleasure. Okay. Whereas the rest of the creation, like, the animals and whatnot, they don't have that, the potential to attain salvation, the potential to be with God for all of eternity. Now that potentiality comes with certain perks, and intellect is one of them. But the reference is not to the intellect, according to this strand of Islam that Ibn Taymiyyah comes from. So does the Quran suggest that salvation is difficult for mankind? I that's an interpretation, obviously. I would say that's not Ibn Taymiyyah's view. I don't think that's Ibn Taymiyyah's view. And the reason being that the verse of the Mithaq actually does not give any such indication. On the contrary, the verse of the Mithaq is quite neutral. I'm gifting you, even from Ibn Taymiyyah's interpretation, I'm gifting you with the faculty to know that I'm here and you should be worshiping me, right? Now, the verse of the Amana, yeah, that ends on a bit of a harsh note, right? Is that إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. Mankind was so ignorant in this regard, he thought he could do it and he didn't do it, right? But the response to that would be, this is a rebuke to those who don't follow the prophets. Because God, I like to joke when I speak with my Christian friends, for God so loved the world that he sent continuous prophets unto us. That's how I like to phrase it, right? So,
like John 3:16.
Exactly, that's my version, right? For God so loved the world, he sent a continuous series of prophets to us, right? So the purpose being that from the perspective of Muslims, by and large, it's not that mankind is disadvantaged, it's that his animalistic instincts cloud his judgment that God blessed him with, right? So again, one could quote the other verse in the Quran that وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. The default, we created man in the best of all ways, right? Then ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ السَّافِلِينَ. The default, you should go up there. The default, how God created you, is that you should rise up. But unfortunately, problems of this world, your animalistic instincts, you're clouding, the realities, you're wanting to follow the traditions of your forefathers. That's what impedes your progress, not God, not the blessings of God, not the fact that God is sending prophets. That would be a fairly mainstream interpretation. So again, Professor Widad has the right to hold that view. I don't think I would subscribe to that view personally.
Right. Okay. Engaging again with Wadad's arguments here, she advocates for the more literal interpretation of this verse. She sees it as the Quran portraying, quote, a momentous and unique dramatic encounter between the divine and the human. She accuses, now she's speaking here of the Mu'tazili, she also brings in the Shia here because there are some Shia traditions also which follow the Mu'tazila here. So she says the Mu'tazili Shi'i perspective reduces this dramatic encounter to a mundane, mediated, ordinary historical series of encounters. But again, she says they deflate the pregnant image of that encounter, taking away the awe it is meant to impart. I want to follow up on that. Any quick reactions to that?
That's Ibn Taymiyya as well. Like the dramatic, like the way that Al-Tabari presents it, it truly is a majestic scene.
Yes.
That, like Al-Tabari literally says that God rubbed the back of Adam, and from the backbone, from the spinal cord, from the loins, he extracted every single human being. So one can say that from Al-Tabari's narrative, which is the mainstream Sunni narrative, God created the souls at that point in time from Adam. God created the souls, and all of these souls were like pieces of light, not pieces, rays of light, or blobs of light, call it what you will, right? And that's actually mentioned by a number of early commentators that God spoke to all of these lights because there was no bodies. By the way, we didn't get into this, but Ahl al-Tasawwuf, the Sufis, love this verse, right? Because this is the existence before existence. This is the primordial existence, right? This is the default existence when God created them, and they didn't have bodies, because the tension that the Sufis have between the bodies and the soul, right? And the goal is to keep the soul pure. And so for Sufis,
and zuhud and
exactly, yeah. For Sufis, the Yawm Alast or the Ruz Alast, right? This becomes, the paradigmatic, default. And our goal is to come back to that very beginning. Our goal is to go through this life and corrupt the soul as little as possible, so that when we leave the bodies, again, that Gnosticism element here, when we leave the bodies, the soul is just as pure as it was on Yawm Alast, on Ruzi Alast, right? So the Sufis have a whole different interpretation of this verse here. But obviously for Ibn Taymiyyah, he's not interested in that interpretation. But you have to admit the dramatic scene that even Sufis have and the proto-Sunnis have pre-Ibn Taymiyyah, of an actual billions and billions and billions of people and
Yes.
God is speaking to them directly.
Yes.
And God is saying, am I not your Lord? And collectively, every entity says, yes, you are our Lord. I mean, what an image. And obviously, when you say there is no mithaq, it kind of becomes boring. Like, okay. But anyway, that's just a side point.
Well, it is a dramatic contrast, and you can
Yeah.
see why certain contemporary figures, I'm pretty sure that Tabatabai, the Iranian Shiite interpreter, goes for the aql, or the rationalizing interpretation. And from that perspective, I mean, someone like Tabatabai, we might speak about Rashid Ridda as well, can make the case that no, it's the experience of each individual, as you put it, I think, in your presentation, generation after generation, discovering the adillah, the signs or the indications of God's lordship through their intellectual reflection on the created world. And that's the momentous occasion. But I did want to ask, and this follows from the quotation that I read from Wadad al-Qadi. I mean, she speaks of this, what was her wording? Momentous and unique dramatic encounter, but it's also an image which seems surreal, maybe from a secular point of view. Of course, religious people have no problem with supernatural occurrences, but it's image which seems surreal. Some might accuse it of being irrational. That what does this mean, to scrape from the back? I mean, literally, the Arabic word has to do with back, usually translated as loins, however, etc. I mean, did Ibn Taymiyya, do you think that was part of his hesitancy on this account, that he felt that it was intellectually problematic to imagine this sort of supernatural scene?
I haven't thought about that question, I'll be honest with you. That specific question I haven't thought about. I'll have to think about it. I don't want to commit to an answer.
Okay, no
but
problem.
He does say it is intellectually problematic to have an ishhad or a testimony, from the same person. So he does bring in logic over there. He does bring in rationality over there. But to be honest, would he find it problematic that God created all of the souls? I don't see that. But again, I haven't really thought about that.
Because on other sort of touch points, he would probably advocate for trusting the report against a metaphorical, symbolic interpretation of things.
Exactly the point, which is why it's so surprising. Again, it's just really interesting that Ibn Taymiyya, did not follow his own methodology. Dare I say? I mean, I know some of his students are going to lambaste me for saying this, some of his admirers, and I don't have a problem. By the way, on a personal note, the one thing that I really admire the most about Ibn Taymiyya is his intellectual independence. He couldn't care what anybody thought or said. Whether I agree or disagree with his final views, you cannot deny that he was a man who spoke his mind and defended his views regardless of the consequences. And I think this is actually an indication, like, he actually went again, and this is not the only time, and this is going to get into trouble, but many of those who admire Ibn Taymiyya and think that he's a copycat of the Salaf, I'm sorry, they haven't read the Salaf or Ibn Taymiyya. Ibn Taymiyya is ingenious. Ibn Taymiyya is unique. Ibn Taymiyya is, at many occasions, inventing and breaking away from the theology of those before him, i.e. the Salaf, even as he thinks or he's claiming he's following the Salaf. And this is but one indication. This is a deeper topic, and I know it's going to get me in trouble, so may God protect me. But Ibn Taymiyya is no simplistic Salafi. I'll just say it the way that I want to say it. He's not some literalist, non-critical. On the contrary, he's an intellectual genius, whether you agree or disagree. And he's looking at the tradition before him, and he's honing and sifting, and at times contributing, and at times shaping the very tradition he claims to be defending literally. Anyway, that was a whole different tangent, but I needed
fascinating. And of course, that spirit of independence, I think, ended him up or led him to prison, maybe on more than one occasion.
Multiple times.
I've read somewhere of a report that he kept on writing in prison until literally they took his pen and paper away.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well known. Yeah. And even then they used charcoal and, other stuff that he had to continue. But yeah, they took away his instruments of writing.
Well, this may come as a surprise to you and some of the viewers. I was invited, it must be 10 years ago or so now, to be at an interfaith event here on campus at Notre Dame. And our idea was, okay, we're going to have a couple of Muslims, a couple of Christians, and everyone would choose someone from the other tradition and speak about what they admire of their saintliness, to sort of spread a sort of hermeneutic of spiritual admiration of the other. That was the idea. So there was a Muslim, I think he was from Iran, spoke about Saint Francis. Another Christian spoke about someone from Indonesia, but I spoke about Ibn Taymiyya on that occasion.
Interesting.
And yeah, not everyone appreciated that, actually. That was one of the moments that I got in trouble. So, okay, well, you've been really generous with your time, Yasir. Thank you so much. And it really means a lot to me that we had this exchange, this connection, as you mentioned, coming from different places. But yeah, you've been really gracious and with your wisdom and your time. Thank you for that.
Thank you for hosting me, and appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about Ibn Taymiyyah and the verse of the Mithaq, and hope there was some benefit for you and your viewers.
Thank you. Very best wishes.
Thank you very much. Thanks.